Chapter 7. For Valour. I hope you don't mind me telling you a good deal about Roberta. The fact is, I'm growing very fond of her. The more I observe her, the more I love her. And I notice all sorts of things about her that I like. For instance, she was quite oddly anxious to make other people happy. And she could keep a secret, a tolerably rare accomplishment. Also, she had the power of silent sympathy. That sounds rather dull, I know, but it's not so dull as it sounds. It just means that a person is able to know that you are unhappy, and to love you extra on that account, without bothering you by telling you all the time how sorry she is for you. That was what Bobbie was like. She knew that Mother was unhappy, and that Mother had not told her the reason. So she just loved Mother more, and never said a single word that could let Mother know how earnestly her little girl wondered what Mother was unhappy about. This needs practice. It is not so easy as you might think. Whatever happened, and all sorts of nice, pleasant, ordinary things happened, such as picnics, games, and buns for tea, Bobbie always had these thoughts at the back of her mind. Mother's unhappy. Why? I don't know. She doesn't want me to know. I won't try to find out. But she is unhappy. Why? I don't know. She doesn't... And so on, repeating and repeating like a tune that you don't know the stopping part of. The Russian gentleman still took up a good deal of everybody's thoughts. All the editors and secretaries of societies and members of Parliament had answered Mother's letters as politely as they knew how, but none of them could tell where the wife and children of Mr. Schepansky would be likely to be. Did I tell you that the Russian's very Russian name was that? Bobbie had another quality which you will hear differently described by different people. Some of them call it interfering in other people's business, and some call it helping lame dogs over stiles, and some call it loving kindness. It just means trying to help people. She racked her brains to think of some way of helping the Russian gentleman to find his wife and children. He had learned a few words of English now. He could say good morning, and good night, and please, and thank you, and pretty when the children brought him flowers, and very good when they asked him how he had slept. The way he smiled when he said his English was, Bobbie felt, just too sweet for anything. She used to think of his face because she fancied it would help her to some way of helping him, but it did not. Yet his being there cheered her because she saw that it made Mother happier. She likes to have someone to be good to, even beside us, said Bobbie, and I know she hated to let him have Father's clothes, but I suppose it hurt nice, or she wouldn't have. For many and many a night after the day when she and Peter and Phyllis had saved the train from wreck by waving their little red flannel flags, Bobbie used to wake up screaming and shivering, seeing again that horrible mound and the poor dear trustful engine rushing on towards it, just thinking that it was doing its swift duty and that everything was clear and safe. And then a warm thrill of pleasure used to run through her at the remembrance of how she and Peter and Phyllis and the red flannel petticoats had really saved everybody. One morning a letter came. It was addressed to Peter and Bobbie and Phyllis. They opened it with enthusiastic curiosity, for they did not often get letters. The letter said, "Dear Sir and Ladies, it is proposed to make a small presentation to you in commemoration of your prompt and courageous action in warning the train on the inst, and thus averting what must humanly speaking have been a terrible accident. The presentation will take place at the station at 3 o'clock on the 30th inst, if this time and place will be convenient to you. Yours faithfully, Jabez Inglewood, Secretary, Great Northern and Southern Railway Company." There had never been a prouder moment in the lives of the three children. They rushed to Mother with the letter, and she also felt proud and said so, and this made the children happier than ever. "But if the presentation is money, you must say, 'Thank you, but we'd rather not take it,'" said Mother. "I'll wash your Indian muslins at once," she added. "You must look tidy on an occasion like this." "Phil and I can wash them," said Bobbie, "if you'll iron them, Mother." Washing is rather fun. I wonder whether you've ever done it. This particular washing took place in the back kitchen, which had a stone floor and a very big stone sink under its window. "Let's put the bath on the sink," said Phyllis. "Then we can pretend we're out-of-doors washerwomen like Mother saw in France." "But they were washing in the cold river," said Peter, his hands in his pockets, "and not in hot water." "This is a hot river, then," said Phyllis. "Lend a hand with the bath, there's a dear." "I should like to see a dear lending a hand," said Peter, but he lent his. "Now to rub and scrub and scrub and rub," said Phyllis, hopping joyously about as Bobbie carefully carried the heavy kettle from the kitchen fire. "Oh, no," said Bobbie, greatly shocked. "You don't rub muslin." You put the boiled soap in the hot water and make it all frothy, lathery, and then you shake the muslin and squeeze it ever so gently, and all the dirt comes out. It's only clumsy things like tablecloths and sheets that have to be rubbed." The lilac and the Gloire de Dijon roses outside the window swayed in the soft breeze. "It's a nice drying day, that's one thing," said Bobbie, feeling very grown up. "Oh, I do wonder what wonderful feelings we shall have when we wear the Indian muslin dresses." "Yes, so do I," said Phyllis, shaking and squeezing the muslin in quite a professional manner. "Now we squeeze out the soapy water. No, we mustn't twist them. And then rinse them. I'll hold them while you and Peter empty the bath and get clean water." "A presentation! That means presents," said Peter, as his sisters, having duly washed the pegs and wiped the line, hung up the dresses to dry. "Whatever will it be?" "It might be anything," said Phyllis. "What I've always wanted is a baby elephant. But I suppose they wouldn't know that." "Suppose it was gold models of steam engines," said Bobbie. "Or a big model of the scene of the prevented accident," suggested Peter, "with the little model train and dolls dressed like us and the engine driver and fireman and passengers." "Do you like," said Bobbie doubtfully, drying her hands on the rough towel that hung on a roller at the back of the scullery door, "do you like us being rewarded for saving a train?" "Yes, I do," said Peter downrightly, "and don't you try to come it over us that you don't like it too, because I know you do." "Yes," said Bobbie doubtfully, "I know I do. But oughtn't we to be satisfied with just having done it and not ask for anything more?" "Who did ask for anything more, silly?" said her brother. "Victoria Cross soldiers don't ask for it, but they're glad enough to get it all the same. Perhaps it'll be medals. Then, when I'm very old indeed, I shall show them to my grandchildren and say, 'We only did our duty,' and they'll be awfully proud of me." "You have to be married," warned Phyllis, "or you don't have any grandchildren." "I suppose I shall have to be married some day," said Peter, "but it will be an awful bother having her around all the time. I'd like to marry a lady who had trances and only woke up once or twice a year." "Just to say you were the light of her life and then go to sleep again. Yes, that wouldn't be bad," said Bobbie. "When I get married," said Phyllis, "I shall want him to want me to be awake all the time so that I can hear him say how nice I am." "I think it would be nice," said Bobbie, "to marry someone very poor, and then you'd do all the work and he'd love you most frightfully, and see the blue wood smoke curling up among the trees from the domestic hearth as he came home from work every night. I say, we've got to answer that letter and say that the time and place will be convenient to us. There's the soap, Peter. We're both as clean as clean. That pink box of writing paper you had on your birthday, Phil." It took some time to arrange what should be said. Mother had gone back to her writing, and several sheets of pink paper with scalloped gilt edges and green four-leaved shamrocks in the corner were spoiled before the three had decided what to say. Then each made a copy and signed it with its own name. The threefold letter ran: "Dear Mr. Jabez Inglewood, thank you very much. We did not want to be rewarded, but only to save the train, but we are glad you think so, and thank you very much. The time and place you say will be quite convenient to us. Thank you very much. Your affectionate little friend." Then came the name, and after it, "P.S. Thank you very much." "Washing is much easier than ironing," said Bobbie, taking the clean, dry dresses off the line. "I do love to see things come clean. Oh, I don't know how we shall wait till it's time to know what presentation they're going to present." When at last, it seemed a very long time after, it was the day, the three children went down to the station at the proper time, and everything that happened was so odd that it seemed like a dream. The station master came out to meet them, in his best clothes, as Peter noticed at once, and led them into the waiting room where once they had played the advertisement game. It looked quite different now. A carpet had been put down, and there were pots of roses on the mantelpiece, and on the window ledges. Green branches stuck up like holly and laurel are at Christmas over the framed advertisement of Cook's Tours and the Beauties of Devon and the Paris-Lyons Railway. There were quite a number of people there besides the porter, 2 or 3 ladies in smart dresses, and quite a crowd of gentlemen in high hats and frock coats, besides everybody who belonged to the station. They recognised several people who had been in the train on the red flannel petticoat day. Best of all, their own old gentleman was there, and his coat and hat and collar seemed more than ever different from anyone else's. He shook hands with them, and then everybody sat down on chairs, and a gentleman in spectacles, they found out afterwards that he was the district superintendent, began quite a long speech, very clever indeed. I'm not going to write the speech down. Firstly, because you would think it dull, and secondly because it made all the children blush so, and get so hot about the ears that I am quite anxious to get away from this part of the subject, and thirdly because the gentleman took so many words to say what he had to say that I really haven't time to write them down. He said all sorts of nice things about the children's bravery and presence of mind, and when he had done he sat down, and everyone who was there clapped and said, "Hear, hear." And then the old gentleman got up and said things too. It was very like a prize-giving. And then he called the children one by their names, and gave each of them a beautiful gold watch and chain. And inside the watches were engraved, after the name of the watch's new owner, "From the directors of the Northern and Southern Railway, in grateful recognition of the courageous and prompt action which averted an accident on 1905. The watches were the most beautiful you can possibly imagine, and each one had a blue leather case to live in when it was at home. "You must make a speech now and thank everyone for their kindness," whispered the station master in Peter's ear, and pushed him forward. "Begin, ladies and gentlemen," he added. Each of the children had already said thank you quite properly. "Oh dear," said Peter, but he did not resist the push. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in a rather husky voice. Then there was a pause, and he heard his heart beating in his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he went on with a rush, "it's most awfully good of you, and we shall treasure the watches all our lives, but we really don't deserve it because what we did wasn't anything really. At least, I mean, it was awfully exciting, and what I mean to say, thank you all very much." The people clapped Peter more than they had done the district superintendent, and then everybody shook hands with them, and as soon as politeness would let them, they got away and tore up the hill to Three Chimneys with their watches in their hands. It was a wonderful day, the kind of day that very seldom happens to anybody, and to most of us not at all. "I did want to talk to the old gentleman about something else," said Bobbie, "but it was so public, like being in church." "What did you want to say?" asked Phyllis. "I'll tell you when I've thought about it more," said Bobbie. So when she had thought a little more, she wrote a letter. "My dearest old gentleman," it said, "I want most awfully to ask you something. If you could get out of the train and go by the next, it would do. I do not want you to give me anything. Mother says we ought not to, and besides, we do not want any things. Only to talk to you about a prisoner and captive. Your loving little friend, Bobbie." She got the station master to give the letter to the old gentleman, and next day she asked Peter and Phyllis to come down to the station with her at the time when the train that brought the old gentleman from town would be passing through. She explained her idea to them, and they approved thoroughly. They had all washed their hands and faces, and brushed their hair, and were looking as tidy as they knew how. But Phyllis, always unlucky, had upset a jug of lemonade down the front of her dress. There was no time to change, and the wind happening to blow from the coal yard, her frock was soon powdered with grey, which stuck to the sticky lemonade stains and made her look, as Peter said, like any little gutter child. It was decided that she should keep behind the others as much as possible. "Perhaps the old gentleman won't notice," said Bobbie. "The aged are often weak in the eyes." There was no sign of weakness, however, in the eyes or in any other part of the old gentleman, as he stepped from the train and looked up and down the platform. The three children, now that it came to the point, suddenly felt that rush of deep shyness which makes your ears red and hot, your hands warm and wet, and the tip of your nose pink and shiny. "Oh," said Phyllis, "my heart's thumping like a steam engine, right under my sash too." "Nonsense," said Peter. "People's hearts aren't under their sashes." "I don't care. Mine is," said Phyllis. "If you're going to talk like a poetry book," said Peter, "my heart's in my mouth." "My heart's in my boots, if you come to that," said Roberta. "But do come on, he'll think we're idiots." "He won't be far wrong," said Peter gloomily, and they went forward to meet the old gentleman. "Hullo," he said, shaking hands with them all in turn. "This is a very great pleasure." "It was good of you to get out," Bobbie said, perspiring and polite. He took her arm and drew her into the waiting room, where she and the others had played the advertisement game the day they found the Russian. Phyllis and Peter followed. "Well?" said the old gentleman, giving Bobbie's arm a kind little shake before he let it go. "Well, what is it?" "Oh, please," said Bobbie. "Yes," said the old gentleman. "What I mean to say," said Bobbie. "Well?" said the old gentleman. "It's all very nice and kind," said she. "But," he said, "I wish I might say something," she said. "Say it," said he. "Well then," said Bobbie, and out came the story of the Russian who had written the beautiful book about poor people and had been sent to prison and to Siberia for just that. "And what we want more than anything in the world is to find his wife and children for him," said Bobbie, "but we don't know how." And you must be most horribly clever, or you wouldn't be a direction of the railway. And if you knew how, and would, we'd rather have that than anything else in the world. We'd go without the watches even, if you could sell them and find his wife with the money." And the others said so too, though not with so much enthusiasm. Said the old gentleman, pulling down the white waistcoat that had the big gilt buttons on it. "What did you say the name was? Frying Pansky?" No, said Bobbie earnestly. "I'll write it down for you. It doesn't really look at all like that except when you say it. Have you a bit of pencil in the back of an envelope?" she asked. The old gentleman got out a gold pencil case and a beautiful, sweet-smelling, green Russian leather notebook and opened it at a new page. "Here," he said, "right here." She wrote down SZEZCPANSKY and said, "That's how you write it. You call it Shepansky." The old gentleman took out a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles and fitted them on his nose. When he had read the name, he looked quite different. "That man? Bless my soul," he said. "Why, I've read his book. It's translated into every European language. A fine book, a noble book. And so your mother took him in, like the Good Samaritan. Well, well. I'll tell you what, youngsters, your mother must be a very good woman." "Of course she is," said Phyllis in astonishment. "And you're a very good man," said Bobbie, very shy, but firmly resolved to be polite. "You flatter me," said the old gentleman, taking off his hat with a flourish. "And now am I to tell you what I think of you?" "Oh, please don't," said Bobbie hastily. "Why?" asked the old gentleman. "I don't exactly know," said Bobbie. "Only if it's horrid, I don't want you to. And if it's nice, I'd rather you didn't." The old gentleman laughed. "Well then," he said, "I'll only just say that I'm very glad you came to me about this. Very glad indeed. And I shouldn't be surprised if I found out something very soon. I know a great many Russians in London, and every Russian knows his name. Now tell me all about yourselves." He turned to the others, but there was only one other, and that was Peter. Phyllis had disappeared. "Tell me all about yourself," said the old gentleman again, and quite naturally Peter was stricken dumb. "All right, we'll have an examination," said the old gentleman. "You two sit on the table, and I'll sit on the bench and ask questions." He did, and out came their names and ages, their father's name and business, how long they had lived at Three Chimneys, and a great deal more. The questions were beginning to turn on a herring and a half for 3 halfpence, and a pound of lead and a pound of feathers, when the door of the waiting-room was kicked open by a boot. As the boot entered, everyone could see that its lace was coming undone, and in came Phyllis, very slowly and carefully. In one hand she carried a large tin can, and in the other a thick slice of bread and butter. "Afternoon tea," she announced proudly, and held the can and the bread and butter out to the old gentleman, who took them and said, "Bless my soul." "Yes," said Phyllis. "That's very thoughtful of you," said the old gentleman. "Very." "But you might have got a cup," said Bobbie, "and a plate." "Perks always drinks out of the can," said Phyllis, flushing red. "I think it was very nice of him to give it to me at all. Let alone cups and plates," she added. "So do I," said the old gentleman, and he drank some of the tea and tasted the bread and butter. And then it was time for the next train, and he got into it with many good-byes and kind last words. "Well," said Peter, when they were left on the platform, and the tail lights of the train disappeared round the corner, "it's my belief that we've lighted a candle today, like Latimer, you know, when he was being burned, and there'll be fireworks for our Russian before long." And so there were. It wasn't 10 days after the interview in the waiting-room that the 3 children were sitting on the top of the biggest rock in the field below their house, watching the 5:15 steam away from the station along the bottom of the valley. They saw, too, the few people who had got out at the station straggling up the road towards the village, and they saw one person leave the road and open the gate that led across the fields to Three Chimneys, and to nowhere else. "Who on earth?" said Peter, scrambling down. "Let's go and see," said Phyllis. So they did. And when they got near enough to see who the person was, they saw it was their old gentleman himself, his brass buttons winking in the afternoon sunshine, and his white waistcoat looking whiter than ever against the green of the field. "Hullo!" shouted the children, waving their hands. "Hullo!" shouted the old gentleman, waving his hat. Then the 3 started to run, and when they got to him, they hardly had breath left to say, "How do you do?" "Good news," said he. "I've found your Russian friend's wife and child, and I couldn't resist the temptation of giving myself the pleasure of telling him." But as he looked at Bobbie's face, he felt that he could resist that temptation. "Here," he said to her, "you run on and tell him. The other 2 will show me the way." Bobbie ran, But when she had breathlessly panted out the news to the Russian and Mother sitting in the quiet garden, when Mother's face had lighted up so beautifully, and she had said half a dozen quick French words to the exile, Bobbie wished that she had not carried the news. For the Russian sprang up with a cry that made Bobbie's heart leap and then tremble, a cry of love and longing such as she had never heard. Then he took Mother's hand and kissed it gently and reverently, and he sank down in his chair and covered his face with his hands and sobbed. Bobbie crept away. She did not want to see the others just then. But she was as gay as anybody when the endless French talking was over, when Peter had torn down to the village for buns and cakes, and the girls had got tea ready and taken it out into the garden. The old gentleman was most merry and delightful. He seemed to be able to talk in French and English almost at the same moment, and Mother did nearly as well. It was a delightful time. Mother seemed as if she could not make enough fuss about the old gentleman, and she said yes at once when he asked if he might present some goodies to his little friends. The word was new to the children, but they guessed it meant sweets, for the 3 large pink and green boxes, tied with green ribbon, which he took out of his bag, held unheard-of layers of beautiful chocolates. The Russian's few belongings were packed, and they all saw him off at the station. Then Mother turned to the old gentleman and said, "I don't know how to thank you for everything. It has been a real pleasure to me to see you, but we live very quietly. I am so sorry that I can't ask you to come and see us again." The children thought this very hard. When they had made a friend, and such a friend, they would dearly have liked him to come and see them again. What the old gentleman thought they couldn't tell. He only said, "I consider myself very fortunate, madam, to have been received once at your house." "Ah," said Mother, "I know I must seem surly and ungrateful, but—" "You could never seem anything but a most charming and gracious lady," said the old gentleman with another of his bows. And as they turned to go up the hill, Bobbie saw her mother's face. "How tired you look, Mummy," she said. "Lean on me." "It's my place to give Mother my arm," said Peter. "I'm the head man of the family when Father's away." Mother took an arm of each. "How awfully nice," said Phyllis, skipping joyfully, "to think of the dear Russian embracing his long-lost wife. The baby must have grown up a lot since he saw it." "Yes," said Mother. "I wonder whether Father will think I've grown," Phyllis went on, skipping still more gaily. "I've grown already, haven't I, Mother?" "Yes," said Mother. "Oh, yes." And Bobbie and Peter felt her hands tighten on their arms. "Poor old Mummy, you are tired," said Peter. Bobbie said, "Come on, Phil, I'll race you to the gate." And she started the race, though she hated doing it. You know why Bobbie did that. Mother only thought that Bobbie was tired of walking slowly. Even mothers, who love you better than anyone else ever will, don't always understand. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Amateur Fireman. "That's a likely little brooch you've got on, miss," said Perks the porter. "I don't know as ever I see a thing more like a buttercup without it was a buttercup." "Yes," said Bobbie, glad and flushed by this approval. "I always thought it was more like a buttercup almost than even a real one. And I never thought it would come to be mine, my very own. And then Mother gave it to me for my birthday." "Oh, have you had a birthday?" said Perks, and he seemed quite surprised, as though a birthday were a thing only granted to a favoured few. "Yes," said Bobbie. "When's your birthday, Mr. Perks?" The children were taking tea with Mr. Perks in the porter's room among the lamps and the railway almanacs. They had brought their own cups and some jam turnovers. Mr. Perks made tea in a beer can, as usual, and everyone felt very happy and confidential. "My birthday," said Perks, tipping some more dark brown tea out of the can into Peter's cup. "I give up keeping of my birthday afore you was born." "But you must have been born some time, you know," said Phyllis thoughtfully, "even if it was 20 years ago, or 30, or 60, or 70. "Not so long as that, missy," Perks grinned as he answered. "If you really want to know, it was 32 years ago, come the 15th of this month." "Then why don't you keep it?" asked Phyllis. "I've got something else to keep besides birthdays," said Perks briefly. "Oh, what?" asked Phyllis eagerly. "Not secrets?" "No," said Perks. "The kids and the missus." It was this talk that set the children thinking, and presently talking. Perks was, on the whole, the dearest friend they had made. Not so grand as the station master, but more approachable, less powerful than the old gentleman, but more confidential. "It seems horrid that nobody keeps his birthday," said Bobbie. "Couldn't we do something?" "Let's go up to the canal bridge and talk it over," said Peter. "I got a new gut line from the postman this morning. He gave it me for a bunch of roses that I gave him for his sweetheart. She's ill." "Then I do think you might have given her the roses for nothing," said Bobby indignantly. "Nyang, nyang," said Peter disagreeably, and put his hands in his pockets. "He did, of course," said Phyllis in haste. "Directly we heard she was ill we got the roses ready and waited by the gate. It was when you were making the brekker toast. And when he'd said thank you for the roses so many times, much more than he need have, he pulled out the line and gave it to Peter. It wasn't exchange, it was the grateful heart." "Oh, I beg your pardon, Peter," said Bobby. "I am so sorry." "Don't mention it," said Peter grandly. "I knew you would be." So then they all went up to the canal bridge. The idea was to fish from the bridge, but the line was not quite long enough. "Never mind," said Bobby. "Let's just stay here and look at things. Everything's so beautiful." It was. The sun was setting in red splendour over the grey and purple hills, and the canal lay smooth and shiny in the shadow. No ripple broke its surface. It was like a grey satin ribbon between the dusky green silk of the meadows that were on each side of its banks. "It's all right," said Peter, "but somehow I can always see how pretty things are much better when I've something to do. Let's get down onto the towpath and fish from there." Phyllis and Bobby remembered how the boys on the canal boats had thrown coal at them, and they said so. "Oh, nonsense," said Peter. "There aren't any boys here now. If there were, I'd fight them." Peter's sisters were kind enough not to remind him how he had not fought the boys when the coal had last been thrown. Instead they said, "All right then," and cautiously climbed down the steep bank to the towing path. The line was carefully baited, and for half an hour they fished patiently and in vain. Not a single nibble came to nourish hope in their hearts. All eyes were intent on the sluggish waters that earnestly pretended they had never harboured a single minnow, when a loud, rough shout made them start. "Hi!" said the shout in most disagreeable tones. "Get out of that, can't you?" An old white horse coming along the towpath was within half a dozen yards of them. They sprang to their feet and hastily climbed up the bank. "We'll slip down again when they've gone by," said Bobby. But alas, the barge, after the manner of barges, stopped under the bridge. "She's going to anchor," said Peter. "Just our luck." The barge did not anchor, because an anchor is not part of a canal boat's furniture, but she was moored with ropes fore and aft, and the ropes were made fast to the palings and to crowbars driven into the ground. "What are you staring at?" growled the bargee crossly. "We weren't staring," said Bobby. "We wouldn't be so rude." "Rude be blessed," said the man. "Get along with you." "Get along yourself," said Peter. He remembered what he had said about fighting boys, and besides he felt safe halfway up the bank. "We've as much right here as anyone else." "Oh, have you indeed?" said the man. "We'll soon see about that." And he came across his deck and began to climb down the side of his barge. "Oh, come away, Peter, come away," said Bobby and Phyllis in agonised unison. "Not me," said Peter, "but you'd better." The girls climbed to the top of the bank and stood ready to bolt for home as soon as they saw their brother out of danger. The way home lay all downhill. They knew that they all ran well. The bargee did not look as if he did. He was red-faced, heavy, and beefy. But as soon as his foot was on the towing path, the children saw that they had misjudged him. He made one spring up the bank and caught Peter by the leg, dragged him down, set him on his feet with a shake, took him by the ear, and said sternly, "Now then, what do you mean by it? Don't you know as these here waters is preserved? You ain't no right catching fish here, not to say nothing of your precious cheek." Peter was always proud afterwards when he remembered that, with the bargee's furious fingers tightening on his ear, the bargee's crimson countenance close to his own, the bargee's hot breath on his neck, he had the courage to speak the truth. "I wasn't catching fish," said Peter. "It's not your fault, I'll be bound," said the man, giving Peter's ear a twist. Not a hard one, but still a twist. Peter could not say that it was. Bobby and Phyllis had been holding on to the railings above and skipping with anxiety. Now suddenly Bobby slipped through the railings and rushed down the bank towards Peter, so impetuously that Phyllis, following more temperately, felt certain that her sister's descent would end in the waters of the canal. And so it would have done if the bargee hadn't let go of Peter's ear and caught her in his jerseyed arm. "Who are you a-shoving of?" he said, setting her on her feet. "Oh," said Bobby, breathless, "I'm not shoving anybody, at least not on purpose. Please don't be cross with Peter. Of course, if it's your canal, we're sorry and we won't any more. But we didn't know it was yours." "Go along with you," said the bargee. "Yes, we will. Indeed we will," said Bobby earnestly. "But we do beg your pardon, and really we haven't caught a single fish. I'd tell you directly if we had, honour bright I would." She held out her hands, and Phyllis turned out her little empty pocket to show that really they hadn't any fish concealed about them. "Well," said the bargee more gently, "cut along then, and don't you do it again, that's all." The children hurried up the bank. "Chuck us a coat, Maria," shouted the man, and a red-haired woman in a green plaid shawl came out from the cabin door with a baby in her arms and threw a coat to him. He put it on, climbed the bank, and slouched along across the bridge towards the village. "You'll find me up at the Rose and Crown when you've got the kid to sleep," he called to her from the bridge. When he was out of sight, the children slowly returned. Peter insisted on this. "The canal may belong to him," he said, "though I don't believe it does. But the bridge is everybody's. Dr. Forrest told me it's public property. I'm not going to be bounced off the bridge by him or anyone else, so I tell you." Peter's ear was still sore, and so were his feelings. The girls followed him as gallant soldiers might follow the leader of a forlorn hope. "I do wish you wouldn't," was all they said. "Go home if you're afraid," said Peter. "Leave me alone. I'm not afraid." The sound of the man's footsteps died away along the quiet road. The peace of the evening was not broken by the notes of the sedge warbler or by the voice of the woman in the barge, singing her baby to sleep. It was a sad song she sang, something about Bill Bailey and how she wanted him to come home. The children stood leaning their arms on the parapet of the bridge. They were glad to be quiet for a few minutes, because all three hearts were beating much more quickly. "I'm not going to be driven away by any old bargeman, I'm not," said Peter thickly. "Of course not," Phyllis said soothingly. "You didn't give in to him. So now we might go home, don't you think?" "No," said Peter. Nothing more was said till the woman got off the barge, climbed the bank, and came across the bridge. She hesitated, looking at the three backs of the children. Then she said, "Ahem." Peter stayed where he was, but the girls looked around. "You mustn't take no notice of my Bill," said the woman. "His bark's worse than his bite. Some of the kids down Farley way is fair terrors. It was them put his back up calling out about who ate the puppy pie under Marlow Bridge." "Who did?" asked Phyllis. "I dunno," said the woman. "Nobody don't know. But somehow, and I don't know the why nor the wherefore of it, them words is pison to a barge master. Don't you take no notice. He won't be back for 2 hours good. You might catch a parrotfish afore that. The light's good and all," she added. "Thank you," said Bobbie. "You're very kind. Where's your baby?" "Asleep in the cabin," said the woman. "He's all right. Never wakes afore 12. Regular as a church clock, he is." "I'm sorry," said Bobbie. "I would have liked to see him close to." "And a finer you never did see, miss, though I says it." The woman's face brightened as she spoke. "Aren't you afraid to leave it?" said Peter. "Lor love you, no," said the woman. "Who'd hurt a little thing like him? Besides, Spot's there. So long." The woman went away. "Shall we go home?" said Phyllis. "You can. I'm going to fish," said Peter briefly. "I thought we came up here to talk about Perks's birthday," said Phyllis. "Perks's birthday'll keep." So they got down on the towing path again, and Peter fished. He did not catch anything. It was almost quite dark. The girls were getting tired, and as Bobbie said, it was past bedtime, when suddenly Phyllis cried, "What's that?" And she pointed to the canal boat. Smoke was coming from the chimney of the cabin, had indeed been curling softly into the soft evening air all the time, but now other wreaths of smoke were rising, and these were from the cabin door. "It's on fire, that's all," said Peter calmly. "Serve him right." "Oh, how can you?" cried Phyllis. "Think of the poor dear dog." "The baby!" screamed Bobbie. In an instant all three made for the barge. Her mooring ropes were slack, and the little breeze, hardly strong enough to be felt, had yet been strong enough to drift her stern against the bank. Bobbie was first, then came Peter, and it was Peter who slipped and fell. He went into the canal up to his neck, and his feet could not feel the bottom, but his arm was on the edge of the barge. Phyllis caught at his hair. It hurt, but it helped him to get out. Next minute he had leapt onto the barge, Phyllis following. "Not you!" he shouted to Bobbie. "Me, because I'm wet." He caught up with Bobbie at the cabin door and flung her aside very roughly indeed. If they had been playing, such roughness would have made Bobbie weep with tears of rage and pain. Now, though he flung her on to the edge of the hold, so that her knee and her elbow were grazed and bruised, she only cried, "No, not you, me!" and struggled up again, but not quickly enough. Peter had already gone down 2 of the cabin steps into the cloud of thick smoke. He stopped, remembering all he had ever heard of fires, pulled his soaked handkerchief out of his breast pocket, and tied it over his mouth. As he pulled it out, he said, "It's all right, hardly any fire at all." And this, though he thought it was a lie, was rather good of Peter. It was meant to keep Bobbie from rushing after him into danger. Of course it didn't. The cabin glowed red. A paraffin lamp was burning calmly in an orange mist. "Hi," said Peter, lifting the handkerchief from his mouth for a moment. "Hi, baby! Where are you?" he choked. "Oh, let me go," cried Bobbie, close behind him. Peter pushed her back more roughly than before, and went on. Now, what would have happened if the baby hadn't cried, I don't know, but just at that moment it did cry. Peter felt his way through the dark smoke, found something small and soft and warm and alive, picked it up and backed out, nearly tumbling over Bobbie, who was close behind. A dog snapped at his leg, tried to bark, choked. "I've got the kid," said Peter, tearing off the handkerchief and staggering onto the deck. Bobbie caught at the place where the bark came from, and her hands met on the fat back of a smooth-haired dog. It turned and fastened its teeth on her hand, but very gently, as much as to say, "I'm bound to bark and bite if strangers come into my master's cabin, but I know you mean well, so I won't really bite." Bobbie dropped the dog. "All right, old man. Good dog," said she. "Here, give me the baby, Peter. You're so wet you'll give it cold." Peter was only too glad to hand over the strange little bundle that squirmed and whimpered in his arms. "Now," said Bobbie quickly, "you run straight into the Rose and Crown and tell them. Phil and I will stay here with the precious." "Hush, then, a dear, a duck, a darling." "Go now, Peter! Run!" "I can't run in these things," said Peter firmly. "They're as heavy as lead." "I'll walk." "Then I'll run," said Bobbie. "Get on the bank, Phil, and I'll hand you the deer." The baby was carefully handed. Phyllis sat down on the bank and tried to hush the baby. Peter wrung the water from his sleeves and knickerbocker legs as well as he could, and it was Bobbie who ran like the wind across the bridge and up the long, white, quiet twilight road towards the Rose and Crown. There is a nice, old-fashioned room at the Rose and Crown, where bargees and their wives sit of an evening drinking their supper beer and toasting their supper cheese at a glowing basketful of coals that sticks out into the room under a great hooded chimney, and is warmer and prettier and more comforting than any other fireplace I ever saw. There was a pleasant party of barge people around the fire. You might not have thought it pleasant, but they did, for they were all friends or acquaintances, and they liked the same sort of things and talked the same sort of talk. This is the real secret of pleasant society. The bargee Bill, whom the children had found so disagreeable, was considered excellent company by his mates. He was telling a tale of his own wrongs, always a thrilling subject. It was his barge he was speaking about. "And he sent word down, paint her inside out, not naming no colour, d'ye see. So I gets a lot of green paint, and I paints her stem to stern, and I tell you she looked A1. Then he comes along and he says, 'What d'ye paint her all one colour for?' he says. And I says I, 'Cause I thought she'd look fust rate,' says I, 'and I think so still.' And he says, 'Do ye? Then you can just pay for the bloomin' paint yourself,' says he, and I had to, too." A murmur of sympathy ran round the room. Breaking noisily in on it came Bobbie. She burst open the swing door, crying breathlessly, "Bill! I want Bill the bargeman!" There was a stupefied silence. Pots of beer were held in mid-air, paralysed on their way to thirsty mouths. "Oh," said Bobbie, seeing the bargewoman and making for her, "your barge cabin's on fire! Go quickly!" The woman started to her feet and put a big red hand to her waist on the left side, where your heart seems to be when you're frightened or miserable. "Reginald Horace!" she cried in a terrible voice. "My Reginald Horace!" "All right," said Bobbie, "if you mean the baby. Got him out safe. Dog too." She had no breath for more except, "Go on, it's all alight." Then she sank on the alehouse bench and tried to get that breath of relief after running which people call the second wind, but she felt as though she would never breathe again. Bill the bargee rose slowly and heavily, but his wife was 100 yards up the road before he had quite understood what was the matter. Phyllis, shivering by the canal side, had hardly heard the quick approaching feet before the woman had flung herself on the railing, rolled down the bank, and snatched the baby from her. "Don't," said Phyllis reproachfully. "I just got him to sleep." Bill came up later, talking in a language with which the children were wholly unfamiliar. He leapt onto the barge and dipped up pails of water. Peter helped him, and they put out the fire. Phyllis, the bargewoman, and the baby, and presently Bobbie too, cuddled together in a heap on the bank. "Lord help me if it was me left anything as could catch a light," said the woman again and again. But it wasn't she. It was Bill the bargeman, who had knocked his pipe out, and the red ash had fallen on the hearthrug and smouldered there, and at last broken into flame. Though a stern man, he was just. He did not blame his wife for what was his own fault, as many bargemen, and other men too, would have done. Mother was half wild with anxiety when at last the 3 children turned up at 3 Chimneys, all very wet now, for Peter seemed to have come off on the others. But when she had disentangled the truth of what had happened from their mixed and incoherent narrative, she owned that they had done quite right, and could not possibly have done otherwise. Nor did she put any obstacles in the way of their accepting the cordial invitation with which the bargeman had parted from them. "You be here at 7 tomorrow," he had said, "and I'll take you the entire trip to Farley and back, so I will, and not a penny to pay. 19 locks." They did not know what locks were, but they were at the bridge at 7, with bread and cheese and half a soda cake, and quite a quarter leg of mutton in a basket. It was a glorious day. The old white horse strained at the ropes, the barge glided smoothly and steadily through the still water. The sky was blue overhead. Mr. Bill was as nice as anyone could possibly be. No one would have thought that he could be the same man who had held Peter by the ear. As for Mrs. Bill, she had always been nice, as Bobbie said, and so had the baby, and even Spot, who might have bitten them quite badly if he had liked. "It was simply ripping, Mother," said Peter when they reached home, very happy, very tired, and very dirty. "Right over that glorious aqueduct. And locks, you don't know what they're like. You sink into the ground, and then, when you feel you're never going to stop going down, two great black gates open slowly, slowly, you go out, and there you are on the canal, just like you were before." "I know," said Mother. "There are locks on the Thames. Father and I used to go on the river at Marlow before we were married." "And the dear darling ducky baby," said Bobbie. "It let me nurse it for ages and ages, and it was so good. Mother, I wish we had a baby to play with." "And everybody was so nice to us," said Phyllis. "Everybody we met. And they say we may fish whenever we like. And Bill is going to show us the way next time he's in these parts. He says we don't know, really." "He said you didn't know," said Peter. "But, Mother, he said he'd tell all the bargees up and down the canal that we were the real right sort, and they were to treat us like good pals, as we were." "So then I said," Phyllis interrupted, "we'd always each wear a red ribbon when we went fishing by the canal, so they'd know it was us, and we were the real right sort, and be nice to us." "So you've made another lot of friends," said Mother. "First the railway, and then the canal." "Oh, yes," said Bobbie. "I think everyone in the world is friends, if you can only get them to see you don't want to be unfriends." "Perhaps you're right," said Mother, and she sighed. "Come, chicks, it's bedtime." "Yes," said Phyllis. "Oh, dear, and we went up there to talk about what we'd do for Perks's birthday, and we haven't talked a single thing about it." "No more we have," said Bobbie. "But Peter's saved Reginald Horace's life. I think that's about good enough for one evening." "Bobbie would have saved him if I hadn't knocked her down. Twice I did," said Peter loyally. "So would I," said Phyllis, "if I'd known what to do." "Yes," said Mother, "you've saved a little child's life. I do think that's enough for one evening. Oh, my darlings, thank God you're all safe." Chapter 9. The Pride of Perks. It was breakfast time. Mother's face was very bright as she poured the milk and ladled out the porridge. "I've sold another story, chickies," she said. "The one about the King of the Mussels, so there'll be buns for tea. You can go and get them as soon as they're baked. About 11, isn't it?" Peter, Phyllis, and Bobbie exchanged glances with each other, 6 glances in all. Then Bobbie said, "Mother, would you mind if we didn't have the buns for tea tonight, but on the 15th? That's next Thursday." "I don't mind when you have them, dear," said Mother. "But why?" "Because it's Perks's birthday," said Bobbie. "He's 32, and he says he doesn't keep his birthday any more because he's got other things to keep. Not rabbits or secrets, but the kids and the missus." "You mean his wife and children," said Mother. "Yes," said Phyllis. "It's the same thing, isn't it? And we thought we'd make a nice birthday for him. He's been so awfully jolly decent to us, you know, Mother," said Peter, "and we agreed that next Bun Day we'd ask you if we could." "But suppose there hadn't been a Bun Day before the 15th," said Mother. "Oh, then we meant to ask you to let us anticipate it, and go without when the Bun Day came." "Anticipate," said Mother. "I see. Certainly. It would be nice to put his name on the buns with pink sugar, wouldn't it?" "Perks," said Peter. "It's not a pretty name." "His other name's Albert," said Phyllis. "I asked him once." "We might put A.P.," said Mother. "I'll show you how when the day comes." This was all very well as far as it went, but even 14 halfpenny buns with A.P. on them and pink sugar do not of themselves make a very grand celebration. "There are always flowers, of course," said Bobbie later, when a really earnest council was being held on the subject in the hayloft where the broken chaff-cutting machine was, and the row of holes to drop hay through into the hay racks over the mangers of the stables below. "He's got lots of flowers of his own," said Peter. "But it's always nice to have them given you," said Bobbie, "however many you've got of your own. We can use flowers for trimmings to the birthday, but there must be something to trim besides buns." "Let's all be quiet and think," said Phyllis. "No one's to speak until it's thought of something." So they were all quiet, and so very still that a brown rat thought that there was no one in the loft and came out very boldly. When Bobbie sneezed, the rat was quite shocked and hurried away, for he saw that a hayloft where such things could happen was no place for a respectable middle-aged rat that liked a quiet life. "Hooray!" cried Peter suddenly. "I've got it!" He jumped up and kicked at the loose hay. "What?" said the others eagerly. "Why, Perks is so nice to everybody. There must be lots of people in the village who'd like to help to make him a birthday. Let's go round and ask everybody." "Mother said we weren't to ask people for things," said Bobbie doubtfully. "For ourselves, she meant, silly, not for other people. I'll ask the old gentleman too. You see if I don't," said Peter. "Let's ask Mother first," said Bobbie. "Oh, what's the use of bothering Mother about every little thing," said Peter, "especially when she's busy. Come on, let's go down to the village now and begin." So they went. The old lady at the post office said she didn't see why Perks should have a birthday any more than anyone else. "No," said Bobbie, "I should like everyone to have one. Only we know when his is." "Mine's tomorrow," said the old lady, "and much notice anyone will take of it. Go along with you." So they went. And some people were kind, and some were crusty, and some would give and some would not. It is rather difficult work asking for things, even for other people, as you have no doubt found if you have ever tried it. When the children got home and counted up what had been given and what had been promised, they felt that for the first day it was not so bad. Peter wrote down the lists of the things in the little pocket-book where he kept the numbers of his engines. These were the lists. Given: a tobacco pipe from the sweet shop, 1/2 pound of tea from the grocer's, a woolen scarf slightly faded from the draper's, which was the other side of the grocer's, a stuffed squirrel from the doctor. Promised: a piece of meat from the butcher, 6 fresh eggs from the woman who lived in the old turnpike cottage, a piece of honeycomb and 6 bootlaces from the cobbler, and an iron shovel from the blacksmith's. Very early next morning Bobbie got up and woke Phyllis. This had been agreed on between them. They had not told Peter because they thought he would think it silly, but they told him afterwards when it had turned out all right. They cut a big bunch of roses and put it in a basket with the needle-book that Phyllis had made for Bobbie on her birthday, and a very pretty blue necktie of Phyllis's. Then they wrote on a paper, "For Mrs. Ransom, with our best love, because it is her birthday." And they put the paper in the basket, and they took it to the post office, and went in and put it on the counter and ran away before the old woman at the post office had time to get into her shop. When they got home, Peter had grown confidential over helping Mother to get the breakfast, and had told her their plans. "There's no harm in it," said Mother, "but it depends how you do it. I only hope he won't be offended and think it's charity. Poor people are very proud, you know." "It isn't because he's poor," said Phyllis. "It's because we're fond of him." "I'll find some things that Phyllis has outgrown," said Mother, "if you're quite sure you can give them to him without his being offended. I should like to do some little thing for him because he's been so kind to you. I can't do much because we're poor ourselves. What are you writing, Bobbie?" "Nothing particular," said Bobbie, who had suddenly begun to scribble. "I'm sure he'd like the things, Mother." The morning of the 15th was spent very happily in getting the buns and watching Mother make AP on them with pink sugar. You know how it's done, of course. You beat up whites of eggs and mix powdered sugar with them and put in a few drops of cochineal. And then you make a cone of clean white paper with a little hole at the pointed end, and put the pink egg sugar in at the big end. It runs slowly out at the pointed end, and you write the letters with it just as though it were a great fat pen full of pink sugar ink. The buns looked beautiful with AP on every one, and when they were put in a cool oven to set the sugar, the children went up to the village to collect the honey and the shovel and the other promised things. The old lady at the post office was standing on her doorstep. The children said "Good morning" politely as they passed. "Here, stop a bit," she said. So they stopped. "Those roses," said she. "Did you like them?" said Phyllis. "They were as fresh as fresh. I made the needle-book, but it was Bobbie's present." She skipped joyously as she spoke. "Here's your basket," said the post office woman. She went in and brought out the basket. It was full of fat red gooseberries. "I dare say Perks's children would like them," said she. "You are an old dear," said Phyllis, throwing her arms around the old lady's fat waist. "Perks will be pleased." "He won't be half so pleased as I was with your needle-book and the tie and the pretty flowers and all," said the old lady, patting Phyllis's shoulder. "You're good little souls, that you are. Look here, I've got a pram round the back in the wood lodge. It was got for my Emmy's first, that didn't live but 6 months, and she never had but that one. I'd like Mrs. Perks to have it. It'd be a help to her with that great boy of hers. Will you take it along?" "Oh!" said all the children together. When Mrs. Ransom had got out the perambulator and taken off the careful papers that covered it, and dusted it all over, she said, "Well, there it is. I don't know but what I'd have given it to her before if I'd thought of it. Only I didn't quite know if she'd accepted it from me. You tell her it was my Emmy's little one's pram. Oh, isn't it nice to think that there is going to be a real live baby in it again?" "Yes," said Mrs. Ransom, sighing, and then laughing. "Here, I'll give you some peppermint cushions for the little ones, and then you run along before I give you the roof off my head and the clothes off my back." All the things that had been collected for Perks were packed into the perambulator, and at 3:30 Peter and Bobbie and Phyllis wheeled it down to the little yellow house where Perks lived. The house was very tidy. On the window ledge was a jug of wildflowers, big daisies and red sorrel and feathery flowery grasses. There was a sound of splashing from the wash-house, and a partly washed boy put his head round the door. "Mother's a-changing of herself," he said. "Down in a minute," a voice sounded from the narrow, freshly scrubbed stairs. The children waited. Next moment the stairs creaked, and Mrs. Perks came down buttoning her bodice. Her hair was brushed very smooth and tight, and her face shone with soap and water. "I'm a bit late changing, miss," she said to Bobbie, "owing to me having had a extra clean-up today, along o' Perks happening to name its being his birthday. I don't know what put it into his head to think of such a thing. We keeps the children's birthdays, of course, but him and me, we're too old for such like as a general rule." "We knew it was his birthday," said Peter, "and we've got some presents for him outside in the perambulator." As the presents were being unpacked, Mrs. Perks gasped. When they were all unpacked, she surprised and horrified the children by sitting suddenly down on a wooden chair and bursting into tears. "Oh, don't!" said everybody. "Oh, please don't!" And Peter added, perhaps a little impatiently, "What on earth is the matter? You don't mean to say you don't like it?" Mrs. Perks only sobbed. The Perks children, now as shiny-faced as anyone could wish, stood at the wash-house door and scowled at the intruders. There was a silence, an awkward silence. "Don't you like it?" said Peter again, while his sisters patted Mrs. Perks on the back. She stopped crying as suddenly as she had begun. There, don't mind me. I'm all right," she said. "Like it? Why, it's a birthday such as Perks never had, not even when he was a boy and stayed with his uncle, who was a corn chandler on his own account. He failed afterwards. Like it? Oh!" And then she went on and said all sorts of things that I won't write down, because I am sure that Peter and Bobbie and Phyllis would not like me to. Their ears got hotter and hotter, and their faces redder and redder at the kind things Mrs. Perks said. They felt they had done nothing to deserve all this praise. At last Peter said, "Look here, we're glad you're pleased, but if you go on saying things like that, we must go home. And we did want to stay and see if Mr. Perks is pleased too, but we can't stand this." "I won't say another single word," said Mrs. Perks with a beaming face, "but that needn't stop me thinking, need it? For if ever—" "Can we have a plate for the buns?" Bobbie asked abruptly, and then Mrs. Perks hastily laid the table for tea, and the buns and the honey and the gooseberries were displayed on plates, and the roses were put in 2 glass jam jars, and the tea table looked, as Mrs. Perks said, fit for a prince. "To think," she said, "me getting the place tidy early, and the little uns getting the wildflowers and all, and never did I think there'd be anything more for him except the ounce of his pet particular that I got him a Saturday and been saving up for him ever since. Bless us, he is early!" Perks had indeed unlatched the latch of the little front gate. "Oh," whispered Bobbie, "let's hide in the back kitchen, and you tell him about it. But give him the tobacco first, because you got it for him, and when you've told him we'll all come in and shout 'Many happy returns.'" It was a very nice plan, but it did not quite come off. To begin with, there was only just time for Peter and Bobbie and Phyllis to rush into the wash-house, pushing the young and open-mouthed Perks children in front of them. There was not time to shut the door, so that without at all meaning it, they had to listen to what went on in the kitchen. The wash-house was a tight fit for the Perks children and the 3 Chimneys children, as well as all the wash-house's proper furniture, including the mangle and the copper. "Hello, old woman," they heard Mr. Perks's voice say. "Here's a pretty set-out." "It's your birthday tea, Bert," said Mrs. Perks, "and there's a ounce of your extra particular. I got it a Saturday along o' your happening to remember it was your birthday today." "Good old girl," said Mr. Perks, and there was a sound of a kiss. "But what's that pram doing here? And what's all these bundles? Where did you get the sweet stuff and—" The children did not hear what Mrs. Perks replied, because just then Bobbie gave a start, put her hand in her pocket, and all her body grew stiff with horror. "Oh," she whispered to the others, "whatever shall we do? I forgot to put the labels on any of the things. He won't know what's from who. He'll think it's all from us, and that we're trying to be grand or charitable or something horrid." "Hush," said Peter. and then they heard the voice of Mr. Perks, loud and rather angry. "I don't care," he said. "I won't stand it, and so I tell you straight." "But," said Mrs. Perks, "it's them children you make such a fuss about. The children from the Three Chimneys." "I don't care," said Perks firmly. "Not if it was an angel from heaven. We've got on all right all these years, and no favours asked. I'm not going to begin these sort of charity goings-on at my time of life, so don't you think it, Nell." "Oh, hush," said poor Mrs. Perks. "Bert, shut your silly tongue, for goodness sake. The all three of them's in the wash-house are listening to every word you speaks." "Then I'll give them something to listen to," said the angry Perks. "I've spoke my mind to 'em afore now, and I'll do it again," he added, and he took 2 strides to the wash-house door and flung it wide open, as wide, that is, as it would go, with the tightly packed children behind it. "Come out," said Perks. "Come out and tell me what you mean by it. Have I ever complained to you of being short, as you comes this charity lay over me?" "Oh," said Phyllis, "I thought you'd be so pleased. I'll never try to be kind to anyone else as long as I live. No, I won't. Not never." She burst into tears. "We didn't mean any harm," said Peter. "It ain't what you mean so much as what you does," said Perks. "Oh, don't," cried Bobbie, trying hard to be braver than Phyllis and to find more words than Peter had done for explaining in. "We thought you'd love it. We always have things on our birthdays." "Oh, yes," said Perks. "Your own relations, that's different." "Oh, no," Bobbie answered. "Not our own relations. All the servants always gave us things at home, and us to them when it was their birthdays. And when it was mine, and Mother gave me the brooch like a buttercup, Mrs. Viney gave me 2 lovely glass pots, and nobody thought she was coming the charity lay over us." "If it had been glass pots here," said Perks, "I wouldn't have said so much. It's there being all this heaps and heaps of things I can't stand. No, nor won't neither." "But they're not all from us," said Peter, "only we forgot to put the labels on. They're from all sorts of people in the village." "Who put 'em up to it, I'd like to know?" asked Perks. "Why, we did," sniffed Phyllis. Perks sat down heavily in the elbow chair and looked at them with what Bobbie afterwards described as withering glances of gloomy despair. "So you've been round telling the neighbours we can't make both ends meet? Well, now you've disgraced us as deep as you can in the neighbourhood, you can just take the whole bag of tricks back where it came from. Very much obliged, I'm sure. I don't doubt but what you meant it kind, but I'd rather not be acquainted with you any longer if it's all the same to you." He deliberately turned the chair round so that his back was turned to the children. The legs of the chair grated on the brick floor, and that was the only sound that broke the silence. Then suddenly Bobbie spoke. "Look here," she said, "this is most awful." "That's what I says," said Perks, not turning round. "Look here," said Bobbie desperately, "we'll go if you like, and you needn't be friends with us any more if you don't want, but we shall always be friends with you, however nasty you are to us," sniffed Phyllis wildly. "Be quiet," said Peter in a fierce aside. "But before we go," Bobbie went on desperately, "do let us show you the labels we wrote out to put on the things." "I don't want to see no labels," said Perks, "except proper luggage ones in my own walk of life. Do you think I've kept respectable and out of debt on what I gets, and her having to take in washing to be give away for a laughing stock to all the neighbours?" "Laughing?" said Peter. "You don't know." "You're a very hasty gentleman," whined Phyllis. "You know you were wrong once before about us not telling you the secret about the Russian. Do let Bobbie tell you about the labels." "Well, go ahead," said Perks grudgingly. "Well then," said Bobbie, fumbling miserably, yet not without hope, in her tightly stuffed pocket, "we wrote down all the things everybody said when they gave us the things, with the people's names, because Mother said we ought to be careful, because... But I wrote down what she said, and you'll see." But Bobbie could not read the labels just at once. She had to swallow once or twice before she could begin. Mrs. Perks had been crying steadily ever since her husband had opened the wash-house door. Now she caught her breath, choked, and said, "Don't you upset yourself, Missy. I know you meant it kind if he doesn't." "May I read the labels?" said Bobbie, crying onto the slips as she tried to sort them. "Mother's first. It says, 'Little clothes for Mrs. Perks's children.' Mother said, 'I'll find some of Phyllis's things that she's grown out of if you're quite sure Mr. Perks wouldn't be offended and think it's meant for charity. I'd like to do some little thing for him because he's so kind to you. I can't do much because we're poor ourselves.'" Bobbie paused. "That's all right," said Perks. "Your ma's a born lady. We'll keep the little frocks and what not, Nell." "Then there's the perambulator and the gooseberries and the sweets," said Bobbie. "They're from Mrs. Ransom. She said, 'I dare say Mr. Perks's children would like the sweets, and the perambulator was got for my Emmy's first. It didn't live but 6 months, and she's never had but that one. I'd like Mrs. Perks to have it. It would be a help with her fine boy. I'd have given it before if I'd been sure she'd accept of it from me. She told me to tell you," Bobbie added, "that it was her Emmie's little one's pram." "I can't send that pram back, Bert," said Mrs. Perks firmly, "and I won't, so don't you ask me." "I'm not asking anything," said Perks gruffly. "Then the shovel," said Bobbie. "Mr. James made it for you himself, and he said, where is it? Oh yes, here. He said, 'You tell Mr. Perks it's a pleasure to make a little trifle for a man as is so much respected.' And then he said he wished he could shoe your children and his own children like they do the horses, because, well, he knew what shoe leather was." "James is a good enough chap," said Perks. "Then the honey," said Bobbie in haste, "and the bootlaces. He said he respected a man that paid his way, and the butcher said the same, and the old turnpike woman said many was the time you'd lent her a hand with her garden when you were a lad, and things like that came home to roost. I don't know what she meant. And everybody who gave anything said they liked you, and it was a very good idea of ours, and nobody said anything about charity or anything horrid like that. And the old gentleman gave Peter a gold pound for you, and said you were a man who knew your work, and I thought you'd love to know how fond people are of you, and I never was so unhappy in my life. Good-bye. I hope you'll forgive us some day." She could say no more, and she turned to go. "Stop," said Perks, still with his back to them. "I take back every word I've said contrary to what you'd wish. Nell, set on the kettle." "We'll take the things away if you're unhappy about them," said Peter, "but I think everybody'll be most awfully disappointed as well as us." "I'm not unhappy about them," said Perks. "I don't know," he added, suddenly wheeling the chair around and showing a very odd-looking, screwed-up face. "I don't know as I was ever better pleased. Not so much with the presents, though they're an A1 collection, but the kind respect of our neighbours. That's worth having, eh, Nell?" "I think it's all worth having," said Mrs. Perks, "and you've made a most ridiculous fuss about nothing, Bert, if you ask me." "No, I ain't," said Perks firmly. "If a man didn't respect hisself, no one wouldn't do it for him." "But everyone respects you," said Bobbie. "They all said so." "I knew you'd like it when you really understood," said Phyllis brightly. "Humph. You'll stay to tea?" said Mr. Perks. Later on Peter proposed Mr. Perks's health, and Mr. Perks proposed a toast, also honoured in tea, and the toast was, "May the garland of friendship be ever green," which was much more poetical than anyone had expected from him. "Jolly good little kids, those," said Mr. Perks to his wife as they went to bed. "Oh, they're all right, bless their hearts," said his wife. "It's you that's the aggravatingest old thing that ever was. I was ashamed of you, I tell you." "You needn't be, old gal. I climbed down handsome soon as I understood it wasn't charity, but charity's what I never did abide, and won't neither." All sorts of people were made happy by that birthday party. Mr. Perks and Mrs. Perks and the little Perkses by all the nice things and by the kind thoughts of their neighbours, the Three Chimneys children by the success, undoubted though unexpectedly delayed, of their plan, and Mrs. Ransom every time she saw the fat Perks baby in the perambulator. Mrs. Perks made quite a round of visits to thank people for their kind birthday presents, and after each visit felt that she had a better friend than she had thought. "Yes," said Perks reflectively, "it's not so much what you does as what you means, that's what I say. Now if it had been charity—" "Oh, drat charity," said Mrs. Perks. "Nobody won't offer you charity, Bert, however much you was to want it, I lay. That was just friendliness, that was." When the clergyman called on Mrs. Perks, she told him all about it. "It was friendliness, wasn't it, sir?" said she. "I think," said the clergyman, "it was what is sometimes called loving kindness. So you see it was all right in the end. But if one does that sort of thing, one has to be careful to do it in the right way. For as Mr. Perks said, when he had time to think it over, it's not so much what you do as what you mean." End of chapter 9.